I stared at my name tag in disbelief, my fingers trembling as they traced the elegant calligraphy, the old lady who's paying for everything. In that crystalline moment at my granddaughter's wedding reception, a celebration that had cost me $45,000, I finally saw the truth I had been avoiding for 3 years since my husband's death. I wasn't a cherished mother and grandmother to my family. I was their personal ATM. At 65, I had spent my life building a family I thought was bound by love and respect. My late husband Thomas and I had raised our son David with everything we could provide, not just financially, but with values and principles we believed would shape him into a compassionate man. Standing in the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, watching guests glance awkwardly at my name tag, I felt those decades of family building crumble beneath my sensible shoes. "Mom, come meet the Johnsons," David called across the room, waving me over to a well-dressed couple. Dad used to golf with Bill. As I approached reluctantly, my son's next words confirmed what the name tag had already revealed. "Mom, our walking bank account," he added with a laugh that sliced through my heart. Bill Johnson looked uncomfortable, while his wife Martha's smile faltered as her eyes dropped to my name tag. I had spent the morning of the wedding carefully preparing myself, choosing the pale blue dress Thomas had always loved, styling my silver hair just so, even applying the perfume he'd given me on our last anniversary before cancer claimed him 3 years ago. I had looked in the mirror and whispered, "You look beautiful, Eleanor." Imagining Thomas saying those words, now I felt foolish and naive. The humiliation burned deep, but it was the realization of how systematically I'd been manipulated that truly stunned me. For 3 years, I had been writing checks, $30,000, for a kitchen remodel that morphed into a complete home renovation, luxury cars for both grandchildren when they turned 18, family vacations I was invited to join and expected to fund. When I tallied the evidence in my financial records the next day, the sum was staggering. Nearly $250,000 poured into maintaining David and Karen's lifestyle. The pattern was always the same. They would invite me to dinner with unusual attentiveness, reminisce about Thomas, inquire about my well-being, and then unveil their latest financial challenge. David would refill my wine glass, while Karen would explain how they were a bit stretched right now. The expectation of my assistance was never framed as asking. It was presented as an opportunity for me to help out the family, since Dad left you quite comfortable. What they didn't know was that during that wedding reception, Thomas's attorney, George Thompson, had approached me. Seeing my name tag and overhearing some comments, he had taken me aside and revealed something extraordinary, a codicil to Thomas's will that I never knew existed. My husband, perhaps knowing his son better than I did, had added a provision shortly before his death: any descendant who publicly humiliated me would forfeit their entire inheritance. He wanted them to treat you right because they loved you, not because they feared losing their inheritance. George explained quietly as I stared at the legal document with trembling fingers. The day after the wedding, the manipulation continued. Karen called, her voice dripping with that syrupy quality I'd come to recognize, to ask if I would fund Sarah and Jason's 2-week honeymoon to Bali. Jason's parents were supposed to pay, but his father's business has been struggling, she explained, as if this automatically transferred the financial responsibility to me. Sarah is just devastated. Something had shifted within me, though, for the first time, I replied, "I'll think about it," rather than immediately agreeing. The pause on the other end of the line spoke volumes. It was my grandson Michael who showed me that not all of my family saw me as a walking checkbook. At 21, he came to my door the day after the wedding, concerned about the name tag incident. It wasn't right, he said simply, his kind eyes so like his grandfather's, filled with genuine care. He even revealed that David and Karen had been discussing how to convince me to move into Sunrise Acres retirement home, eyeing the profit from selling my house. It was then I understood they didn't just want my money. They wanted everything, every last piece of what Thomas had built for us, including our home filled with 40 years of memories. The realization was like ice water in my veins, clearing away the fog of grief and compliance that had clouded my judgment since Thomas's death. I didn't confront them immediately with the codicil. Instead, I watched as they continued to reveal their true selves. I began setting boundaries, reclaiming my independence, and rediscovering parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. I enrolled in painting classes, reconnected with old friends, and invested in Michael's dream of opening a bookstore. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather a quiet revolution of self-respect. With each refusal of their financial demands, with each pursuit of my own interests, I felt Thomas's presence beside me, nodding in approval. He had tried to protect me with legal provisions, but in the end, I needed to learn to protect myself, and that not the money or the inheritance or even the justice that would eventually come was the true gift. He had left me the opportunity to reclaim my dignity and discover that I was worth far more than the price tag my family had placed on me. This is a codicil to Thomas's will. He added it shortly before he passed. With those words, George Thompson, my late husband's attorney, handed me an envelope that would change everything. Standing in the hallway outside the ladies' room at my granddaughter's wedding reception, my eyes still red from tears of humiliation, I accepted the document with trembling fingers. Only moments before, I had discovered my name tag read, "The old lady who's paying for everything," instead of Eleanor Mitchell, grandmother of the bride. My son David had laughed it off when I confronted him, saying, "Oh, Mom, don't be so sensitive to Ma. It's just a joke. Everyone knows you're the one with the deep pockets since Dad left you everything." Now, as I carefully unfolded the legal document George had handed me, the words swam before my eyes. The legal language was complex, but the meaning was unmistakable. Any descendant who publicly humiliated me would be disinherited from their share of Thomas's fortune, a fortune apparently much larger than even I had realized. I looked up at George, my mind reeling. Why wouldn't he tell me about this? George's eyes were kind but serious. He hoped it would never be needed, he said quietly. He wanted them to treat you right because they loved you, not because they feared losing their inheritance. I glanced back toward the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, where Sarah and Jason's wedding reception continued in full swing. My family was celebrating, completely unaware that their behavior had just cost them millions. Thomas and I had been married for 40 years before cancer took him 3 years ago. I thought I knew everything about him, his morning routine of coffee and crosswords, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, how he could fix almost anything with his toolbox and enough patience. But this revelation showed me a side of my husband I hadn't fully appreciated: his foresight, his protectiveness, and perhaps most painfully, his understanding of our son's character. Had Thomas known all along what David was capable of? Had he seen the seeds of entitlement and greed that I had either missed or refused to acknowledge? The thought that Thomas might have carried this knowledge silently, protecting me even as his body failed him, brought fresh tears to my eyes. "What do you want to do?" George asked gently. I carefully folded the document and handed it back to him. "Nothing. Not yet. I need to see just how far they'll go." As I returned to the reception, the offensive name tag felt heavier against my chest. But now, instead of shame, I felt something different stirring inside me, a determination to finally see my family for who they truly were. Over the next few days, the evidence mounted. Karen called to ask if I would fund Sarah and Jason's honeymoon to Bali since his parents had backed out. When I hesitated, rather than immediately agreeing, there was shocked silence on the line. Then my grandson Michael revealed that David and Karen had been discussing how to convince me to move into Sunrise Acres retirement home, eyeing the profit from selling my house. 3 days after the wedding, David and Karen organized a post-wedding brunch at their country club. I attended out of curiosity, wanting to see if the name tag incident had been an anomaly or part of a pattern. It didn't take long to get my answer. During the brunch, Karen clinked her glass and announced to all the guests that I would be funding Sarah and Jason's dream honeymoon to Bali, something I had never agreed to do. When I publicly corrected her, David grabbed my arm painfully and hissed, "Mom, don't make a scene." That evening, when David showed up at my house, angry about the performance at brunch, I knew it was time to make some changes. The truth was, I didn't want to use the codicil immediately. Disinheriting my son and his family would be a final step, one that couldn't be undone. And part of me still hoped, perhaps foolishly, that David could change, that he could remember the values Thomas and I had tried to instill in him. I decided to see George again and learn the full extent of Thomas's estate. The numbers took my breath away. Thomas had built several companies over his lifetime, sold them at precisely the right moments, and made conservative investments that weathered economic downturns beautifully. Thomas was a private man when it came to money, George explained. He always said you married him when he had nothing but potential and a beat-up Chevy. He never wanted you to become one of those women who only care about designer labels and country club memberships. See, I laughed softly, hearing Thomas's voice in those words. That sounds like him. As for the codicil, George continued, it's straightforward but powerful. Any descendant who publicly humiliates you forfeits their entire inheritance. The name tag incident at the wedding would certainly qualify, and the brunch too, most likely. But Eleanor, you don't have to make any decisions right now. The codicil remains in effect for your lifetime. I nodded, thinking, what if I wanted to make some changes of my own to my will, to how my assets are managed? George leaned forward. What did you have in mind? By the time I left his office, I had a plan. No dramatic confrontations, no ultimatums, just a quiet reclaiming of my life and my power. Thomas had tried to protect me with his codicil, but in the end, I would need to learn to protect myself. That night, I removed Thomas's photograph from my bedside table and held it close. You knew, didn't you? I whispered. You tried to shield me even after you were gone. For the first time since his death, I felt his presence not as a ghost of grief, but as a partner in strength. Thomas hadn't left me defenseless. He'd left me with choices. And now, finally, I was ready to make them. The morning after Sarah's wedding, I found myself sitting alone at my kitchen table, still in my bathrobe, staring at the offensive name tag I'd placed in front of me like some grotesque souvenir. The old lady who's paying for everything. It mocked in elegant calligraphy that must have cost extra. Someone had paid a professional calligrapher to humiliate me, probably on my dime. 3 years. It had been 3 years since Thomas had been taken by cancer, 3 years of grief and loneliness, and apparently 3 years of being systematically drained by my own family. The realization settled over me like a heavy blanket as I traced the letters with my fingertip, remembering how Thomas would have reacted if he'd seen this tag. His temper was rare, but formidable when someone disrespected those he loved. "They've changed," I whispered to the empty room as if Thomas could hear me. Or maybe they were always this way, and we just didn't want to see it. I rose from the table, drawn to the large family portrait above the fireplace in our living room. It was taken 5 years ago on our 40th anniversary. Thomas sat in the center, still robust despite the early signs of the illness that would later claim him. I stood beside him, my hand on his shoulder. David and Karen flanked us, and Sarah and her brother Michael, then teenagers, stood in front. We looked happy. We looked like a family. When exactly had things changed? The question haunted me as I made my morning tea. Perhaps it had begun gradually, so subtle I hadn't noticed the erosion of respect until it was too late. The first clear memory came just 6 months after Thomas's funeral. David and Karen had invited me to dinner, a rare occurrence even then. They'd been unusually attentive, asking about my well-being, reminiscing about Thomas. Then, over dessert, they'd broached the real purpose of the evening. "Mom," David had said, refilling my wine glass, "Karen and I have been thinking about remodeling our kitchen. Nothing fancy, just updating the appliances, new countertops, that sort of thing." "That sounds lovely," I'd replied, oblivious to what was coming. "The thing is," Karen continued smoothly, "with college tuition for the kids and everything else, we're a bit stretched right now." And I remembered the pause, the expectant looks. "Are you asking me for money?" "Not asking," David had said quickly. "It's just that Dad left you quite comfortable, and we thought maybe you'd want to help out the family." I'd written them a check for $30,000 that evening. Looking back now with clear eyes, I realized that had been the beginning of what Thomas would have called the slippery slope. Small requests became larger ones. A kitchen remodel became a full home renovation. Tuition assistance became luxury cars for both Sarah and Michael when they turned 18. Family vacations that I was invited to join and expected to fund. With sudden determination, I opened the hallway closet and pulled out a box of financial records. Sitting on the floor like a schoolgirl, I began sorting through bank statements and canceled checks. The evidence of my financial support for David and Karen's lifestyle was overwhelming. Over 3 years, I had given them nearly $250,000, $250,000. The phone rang, interrupting my tally. It was Karen. "Eleanor, are you home? I've been calling your cell phone." I hadn't even noticed my cell phone was still in my evening purse. "Yes, I'm home. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. David and I just wanted to thank you for everything yesterday. Wasn't the wedding beautiful?" "Yes, it was lovely," I said mechanically. "Sarah and Jason are so grateful for your generosity. They couldn't have had such a wonderful wedding without you." I closed my eyes, remembering the $45,000 check I'd written for the venue and catering. I was happy to help. "Actually, that's partly why I'm calling," Karen continued, her voice taking on that syrupy quality I'd come to recognize. "Jason's parents were supposed to pay for the honeymoon, but his father's business has been struggling, and they've had to back out. Sarah is just devastated." I could hear what was coming next. "We were wondering if you might be able to help. They've got their hearts set on 2 weeks in Bali. David and I would contribute, of course, with everything we spent on the wedding. Everything they spent, I had covered almost all of it. "I'll think about it," I said, surprising both of us with my non-committal response. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, well, they need to book soon to get the best rates. I understand. I'll let you know tomorrow." And after hanging up, I returned to my financial archaeology project. Thomas had always warned me about David's relationship with money. "He sees it as the solution to everything," he told me once. "But money without values just creates more problems." I hadn't understood then, or perhaps I hadn't wanted to understand. Now, surrounded by the paper trail of my own exploitation, Thomas's words echoed in my mind. When had I become an ATM instead of a mother? When had my value to my family become measured in dollars rather than love? The worst part was how blind I'd been to it all. Each request had seemed reasonable on its own. Each check written from a place of genuine desire to help my family. But collectively, they told a different story, one of calculated manipulation and entitlement. I gathered the statements and checks, organizing them by date. It was all here: $30,000 for the kitchen remodel, $15,000 for a temporary cash flow problem when David didn't get his expected bonus, $22,000 for Sarah's study abroad program that seemed to feature more Instagram posts from beaches than classrooms, $18,000 toward Michael's tuition, the only expenditure I didn't regret, $45,000 for the wedding, and dozens of smaller amounts that had seemed insignificant at the time. The grand total, $247,850, nearly $250,000 in just 3 years, with nothing to show for it except a name tag that proclaimed my sole value to my family, the old lady who's paying for everything. I slid the papers back into the box, my hands steady now with resolve rather than shaking with hurt. Thomas had left me with financial security, but what good was that if I allowed myself to be emotionally bankrupt? What good was money if it became the only language my family spoke to me? As I closed the box, I made a promise to myself. The Bank of Eleanor Mitchell was officially closed. From now on, my resources, emotional and financial, would be invested where they were truly valued, starting with myself. The realization didn't make me feel powerful or vindicated. Instead, there was a profound sadness in acknowledging what my family had become in Thomas's absence. But beneath the sadness lay something else, a glimmer of the woman I used to be before grief and manipulation had dimmed my spirit. That woman had been strong. That woman had been respected. It was time to find her again. A knock at the door startled me as I sat surrounded by bank statements and canceled checks that documented 3 years of financial exploitation. Through the peephole, I saw Michael, my grandson, shifting nervously on the porch. I quickly gathered up the scattered financial papers and stashed them back in the closet before opening the door. "Grandma," he said, stepping forward to hug me. At 21, he was tall like Thomas, with the same kind eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. In a family that had become increasingly focused on appearances and status, Michael had always been different. "Are you okay?" "I've been texting you, Matt," he said, concern etched across his young face. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a bit tired after yesterday. Come in." I led him to the kitchen where I put on the kettle for fresh tea, grateful for his company and the momentary distraction from my disturbing discoveries. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday, Pei," he said, sitting at the table where Thomas had once solved crossword puzzles on Sunday mornings. The name tag, the way everyone was talking, it wasn't right. I felt a lump form in my throat. In all the humiliation of the previous day, Not a single family member had acknowledged the cruelty of the joke, except Michael. You noticed. Of course I noticed. So did a lot of people. He looked down, embarrassed. I should have said something. I patted his hand, warm and solid, on the kitchen table. It's not your responsibility to correct your parents, but it is my responsibility to stand up for what's right. His eyes, so like Thomas's, met mine directly. Dad and Mom, they've changed since Grandpa died, or maybe I just didn't see it before. All they talk about is money, your money, specifically. My heart tightened. What do you mean? Michael hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Last week, I overheard them discussing your house. Dad said something about how it's too big for one person and how they could help you downsize. Chung, the kettle whistled, giving me a moment to absorb this information. As I poured hot water over the tea bags, I thought about George Thompson and the codicil to Thomas's will. I thought about the name tag, the constant requests for money, and now this apparent plan to move me out of my home. My house was my sanctuary, filled with 40 years of memories. Thomas's workshop in the garage, where he'd taught both David and Michael to build birdhouses. The kitchen where I'd perfected Thomas's favorite apple pie. The garden where we'd celebrated countless birthdays and anniversaries. The idea that David and Karen were eyeing it as just another asset to liquidate made me feel physically ill. Grandma, Michael's voice brought me back to the present. Are you sure you're okay? I set the teapot on the table and sat across from him. I'm better than okay. Michael, I think I'm finally seeing things clearly for the first time in years. What do you mean? I smiled, making a decision. Just that it's time for some changes around here. As we sipped our tea, I studied my grandson's face, wondering if he was truly different from his parents, or if the seeds of entitlement were merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. But there was an earnestness in his expression that reminded me so much of Thomas when we first met before the success, before the money. You know, your grandfather would be proud of you, I said. Michael looked surprised. For what, I didn't even stand up for you at the wedding. But you're here now. That counts for something. I hesitated, then decided to trust him with a little more truth. Did you know your father and Karen asked me for $30,000 for a kitchen remodel just 6 months after your grandfather's funeral? His expression darkened. No, but I'm not surprised. They've been renovating something in the house constantly for the last few years. Dad always talks about investments in real estate value, but it seems more like showing off to me. And the car's your sister's expensive study abroad program. Michael nodded slowly. I always wondered how they could afford all of that. Dad's business does well, but not that well. He looked ashamed. Even my car. They told me it was from both of them, but it was from you, wasn't it? I nodded. I didn't mind. Michael, I wanted to help, but I'm starting to see that there's a difference between helping and being taken advantage of. He reached across the table and took my hand. Grandma, I'm so sorry. This isn't right. It's not your fault. Still, I should have seen it. Maybe if I'd paid more attention. Listen to me, I interrupted gently. You are not responsible for your parents' behavior. Thomas, your grandfather, always said that adulthood is when you realize your parents are just people, with all the flaws and failings that implies. The question is what you do with that knowledge. Michael was quiet for a moment. So what are you going to do? I squeezed his hand. I'm not sure yet, but I know I'm done being the family ATM. He grinned suddenly, a flash of the little boy who used to chase butterflies in my garden. Good for you. As our conversation continued, Michael revealed more about his own life. He was finishing college with a degree in English literature and dreamed of opening a small bookstore, but was worried about startup costs. "Grandpa always encouraged me to read," he said. "Remember how he built those bookshelves in my room when I was 10? The ones that went all the way to the ceiling because he said I'd grow into them." I smiled, remembering Thomas's project. He believed in preparing for the future. "The bookstore probably seems silly to you," that Michael said, suddenly self-conscious. "I mean, with online sales and ebooks." "Not at all," I replied. "Your grandfather would have loved the idea. He always said the smell of books was one of civilization's greatest achievements." Michael laughed. "That sounds like him." As he was leaving, Michael hugged me tightly. "Are you sure you're going to be okay? I can come back tomorrow if you want." "I'd like that," I said, surprised to realize how much I meant it. Watching him drive away, I felt a curious mix of emotions: sadness at what my relationship with David had become, anger at the manipulation, but also a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt a cold clarity replace my grief and loneliness. I wouldn't be making any hasty decisions, but I would be watching and waiting to see who in my family truly deserved the legacy Thomas had left. And perhaps, I thought as I closed the door, that legacy wasn't just about money after all. 3 days after Sarah's wedding, David and Karen organized a post-wedding brunch at their country club. I deliberated whether to attend, but curiosity won out. I wanted to see if the name tag incident had been an anomaly or part of a pattern. After my conversation with Michael, I suspected the latter, but some small part of me still hoped to be proven wrong. I selected my outfit with care, a simple but elegant cream pantsuit that Thomas had always said made me look regal. Looking in the mirror, I straightened my shoulders and practiced the serene smile I would need to maintain throughout the event. "You're not a doormat, Eleanor," I told my reflection firmly. "You're Thomas Mitchell's widow, and it's time to act like it." The Oak Ridge Country Club was as ostentatious as I remembered gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and staff dressed in formal attire who seemed to materialize whenever a glass needed refilling. As I entered the private dining room, I noted several guests from the wedding, including Sarah and her new husband Jason, Michael, and various relatives and friends. "Mom, over here," David called, waving me toward the head table. "We saved you a seat." Karen, resplendent in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment, gave me an air kiss. "Eleanor, you look nice," she said, her tone suggesting mild surprise, as if she'd expected me to show up in a bathrobe and curlers. I settled into the chair, noting that I'd been placed next to Jason's parents, whom I barely knew, rather than near my grandchildren. A strategic seating arrangement, no doubt keeping me at a distance from Michael, who might encourage my newfound backbone. The brunch proceeded pleasantly enough with mimosas and small talk. Sarah looked happy, though tired, and Jason was attentive to her. Michael caught my eye from across the table and gave me a small smile of encouragement. I was just beginning to think that perhaps I'd been overly suspicious when Karen clinked her glass for attention. "We want to thank everyone for coming today and for helping make Sarah and Jason's wedding so special," she began, her voice carrying that practiced tone of someone who has given many country club speeches. "And of course, a special thank you to Grandma Eleanor, who has been so incredibly generous." All eyes turned to me. I nodded politely, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "In fact," Karen continued, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, We have an exciting announcement. Grandma will be funding Sarah and Jason's dream honeymoon to Bali. There was a smattering of applause. I sat frozen, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. I'd made no such commitment. After our phone conversation yesterday, I had decided to give Sarah and Jason a modest check enough for a nice honeymoon in New England, perhaps, but certainly not an extravagant trip to Bali. "Mom," David prompted when I didn't immediately acknowledge the announcement. I carefully set my cup down. "This is the first I'm hearing of it," I said, keeping my voice level. An awkward silence fell over the table. Sarah looked confused, then embarrassed. Jason stared at his plate. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with the silver butter knives that gleamed beside our bread plates. "Well, we discussed it yesterday," Karen said with a brittle laugh. "Remember, you said you'd think about it." "Yes, I did say that. And I'm still thinking." The words came out more firmly than I had expected. David leaned over, speaking in a stage whisper clearly meant to be heard. "Mom, don't make a scene. We've already told them they can book the trip." Hey, I felt something inside me snap. A thread that had been stretched too far for too long. "I don't recall agreeing to pay for a honeymoon to Bali," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "In fact, I believe Jason's parents were originally planning to cover this expense." Jason's father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "There were some business setbacks," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. "I understand," I said kindly. "These things happen. But I think it's inappropriate to publicly volunteer someone else's money without their agreement, don't you?" The table fell silent. Karen's face flushed red. David looked mortified. Good. I thought with a vindication that surprised me. Let them feel a fraction of the embarrassment I felt at the wedding. Perhaps Sarah and Jason might consider a more modest honeymoon, I suggested, one within their means. "Their means," Karen hissed, abandoning all pretense of politeness. "What about your means? Everyone knows Thomas left you more than comfortable." Something in her tone, the entitlement, the resentment made my decision clear. "My financial situation is not up for public discussion," I said firmly, "and neither are my spending choices." David grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Mom, stop it. You're embarrassing us." I pulled my arm away. "No, David, you've embarrassed yourselves." I stood up, smoothing my jacket. "Sarah, Jason, I wish you both every happiness. I'd be happy to contribute to a reasonable honeymoon, but I'll discuss that with you privately." As I turned to leave, Michael stood up as well. "I'll walk you out, Grandma." In the lobby, away from prying eyes, I finally let my composure slip. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my car keys. "Are you okay to drive?" Michael asked gently. I nodded, taking a deep breath. "I'm fine, just a bit shaken. You should be proud of yourself." That took courage. I looked at my grandson, really looked at him. In that moment, he reminded me so much of Thomas. It made my heart ache. "Would you like to come over for dinner tonight?" I asked impulsively. Michael smiled. "I'd like that." As I drove home, replaying the scene at the brunch in my mind, I realized I wasn't sorry for standing up for myself. The embarrassment and discomfort I felt were the growing pains of reclaiming my self-respect. For too long, I had allowed myself to be manipulated by David and Karen, funding their lifestyle while they treated me as an afterthought or worse, a burden they had to tolerate to access Thomas's money. The name tag at the wedding, the announcement about Bali at the brunch, these weren't isolated incidents or harmless jokes. They were symptoms of a deeper problem, a fundamental lack of respect and perhaps something even uglier, resentment that Thomas had left his estate to me rather than directly to them. "What would you do, Thomas?" I whispered, imagining my husband in the passenger seat beside me. The answer came clearly, as if he had spoken it aloud. "Exactly what you're doing, Ellie. It's about time." Later that evening, as Michael and I shared a simple meal, I would confide in him about his parents' behavior over the past 3 years. But for now, driving home from the Oak Ridge Country Club with my head held high, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died: pride in myself, and a quiet determination to never again allow anyone to diminish my worth. Later that evening, as Michael and I sat in my kitchen sharing a simple meal of roast chicken, Thomas's favorite, I found myself confiding in my grandson about his parents' behavior over the past 3 years. The words flowed easily, unburdening me of secrets I'd carried alone for too long. "I'm not surprised," Michael said sadly, as I described the continuous financial demands, the gradual erosion of respect. "I've watched it happening. After Grandpa died, it was like they saw you as, I don't know, an ATM," I supplied. He nodded, his expression troubled. "And it's getting worse. Last week, I overheard them talking about your house again." "What did they say?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Michael hesitated. "They were discussing how to convince you to move into Sunrise Acres, the retirement home." I was stunned. My house was my sanctuary, filled with memories of the life Thomas and I had built together. Every corner held a piece of our history, the marks on the kitchen door frame tracking David's growth, the slight dent in the living room wall from when Michael had tried to practice baseball indoors, the garden Thomas had lovingly tended even as his strength began to fail. "Dad said it would be better for everyone if you downsized," Michael continued reluctantly. "He mentioned something about the real estate market being hot and how they could help you maximize your investment." I felt sick. They weren't just after my money. They wanted my home, too. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you," I said, deciding to trust him with the truth about Thomas's codicil. But before I could continue, the doorbell rang. Through the window, I saw David's car in the driveway. "It's your father," I said. Michael's expression hardened. "You don't have to answer it," but I was done hiding. "No, I think it's time we cleared the air." And I opened the door to find David standing there, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell was that performance at brunch?" he demanded, pushing past me into the hallway. Then he spotted Michael. "What are you doing here?" he asked his son, clearly surprised. "Having dinner with Grandma," Michael replied calmly. "Something the rest of you might try sometime without asking for money." David's face darkened. "Stay out of this, Michael. This is between your grandmother and me." "And no," I said firmly. "If we're going to have this conversation, Michael stays. I'm tired of the private manipulations. David, let's put everything on the table." And in that moment, looking at my son's angry face and my grandson's protective stance, I knew we had reached the breaking point. There would be no going back. "I've had enough of your attitude, Mom," David said, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "First, the scene at the brunch, and now I find you've been poisoning Michael's mind against us." I sat calmly in Thomas's old armchair, hands folded in my lap. Michael stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, watching his father with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "No one is poisoning anyone's mind," I replied evenly. "We're simply acknowledging what's been happening in this family since your father died." "And what exactly is that?" David demanded. "You and Karen have been treating Grandma like a bank," Not a person, Michael said before I could answer. The name tag at the wedding, volunteering her to pay for Sarah's honeymoon without asking first, talking about selling her house behind her back. You've been spying on us. David's face flushed darker. I've been paying attention, Michael countered. Something you might try sometime. And David turned to me, his expression shifting to the conciliatory tone he always used when he wanted something. Mom, you're misunderstanding everything. We're just trying to help you manage your finances wisely. You're not getting any younger. I'm 65, David. Not 95, I interrupted. My mind is perfectly sharp, and I'm more than capable of managing my own affairs. But Dad left you so much. Stop. I held up my hand. Thomas left me exactly what he intended to leave me. His estate is not a family piggy bank. David's false smile vanished. So, what are you saying? You're cutting us off because Karen made one stupid joke with a name tag. I'm saying that from now on, I'll be making my own decisions about my money and my home. If Sarah and Jason want a honeymoon in Bali, they can save for it like most young couples do. If you and Karen want a bigger house, you can work for it. David stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Then he turned to Michael. I want to speak to my mother alone. I'm staying, Michael said firmly. This is family business. Exactly, Michael replied. And I'm family. Something shifted in David's expression, a calculation, a reassessment. He'd always been able to manipulate me when we were alone, playing on my emotions, my grief for Thomas, my desire to keep the peace. But with Michael present, those tactics wouldn't work. Fine, he snapped, heading for the door. But this isn't over, Mom, not by a long shot. After he left, Michael let out a long breath. I'm sorry, Grandma. For what, sweetheart? You've done nothing wrong. For not standing up sooner, for letting them treat you this way. I rose and hugged him tightly. You're standing up now. That's what matters. After Michael left, I sat in the quiet of my home, thinking about Thomas, about the codicil to his will, about the family we'd raised together. Had we gone wrong somewhere with David? Or had he always had this streak of entitlement that we'd failed to see? More importantly, what was I going to do now? The answer came slowly, taking shape in my mind like a photograph developing. Instead of confronting David and Karen directly with the codicil, which would only make them change their behavior out of fear rather than respect, I would simply let them continue showing their true colors. Meanwhile, I would quietly reclaim my life and my independence. I would make my own financial decisions without apology or explanation. I would support those who genuinely cared for me like Michael, and I would maintain firm boundaries with those who saw me only as a resource to be exploited. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt like myself again, not just a grieving widow or a walking checkbook, but Eleanor Mitchell, a woman with agency, wisdom, and strength. Thomas would be proud, I thought, and so finally was I. Today was my birthday, my 66th. Despite my protests, Michael had insisted on organizing a small family gathering at my home. It's time they remember whose house this is, he'd said with a grim determination that reminded me so much of Thomas. I spent the morning in my garden, deadheading roses and drawing peace from the simple task. The garden had been another casualty of the past 3 years. I'd neglected it while catering to David and Karen's demands. Now it was coming back to life, much like I was. By mid-afternoon, my home was ready for guests. Michael arrived early to help with final preparations. Are you sure you're ready for this? He asked, arranging cheese and crackers on a platter. As ready as I'll ever be, I replied, smoothing my new dress, a bold red I would never have chosen before. Besides, it's just dinner. But we both knew it was more than that. This was the first time in months that the entire family would be together under my roof. David and Karen, Sarah and Jason, and even a few of Thomas's old friends, including George Thompson. The doorbell rang precisely at 5. David and Karen stood on the porch, their smiles so artificial I could almost hear the plastic stretching. "Happy birthday, Mom," David said, handing me a bouquet of store-bought flowers. "Eleanor, you look different," Karen added, her eyes taking in my new dress, my styled hair, the subtle makeup I'd applied with techniques learned from a class at the community center. "Thank you," I said simply, stepping back to let them enter. Sarah and Jason arrived moments later, followed by George and another couple who had been close friends with Thomas and me. I moved through the greetings and small talk with a composure I would have found impossible 6 months ago. As we settled in the dining room, I couldn't help but notice David's gaze moving around the house, assessing, calculating. Karen's eyes kept returning to the new painting hanging on the wall, a landscape I'd created myself. "Did you redecorate, Eleanor?" she asked, her tone suggesting she found the changes disturbing. "Just a few updates," I replied. "I've been taking painting classes." "Painting classes," David echoed, as if I'd said I was learning to fly spaceships. "Grandma's really talented," Michael said proudly. "She's already sold 2 pieces at the community art fair." "Sold?" Karen looked genuinely confused. "But why would you need to sell paintings?" I smiled. "It's not about need, Karen. It's about joy." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table, broken by Jason asking about the bookstore Michael was planning to open. "It's coming along great," Michael said. "Thanks to Grandma, I've got the business plan finalized and I'm looking at locations." David's head snapped up. "Thanks to Grandma, what does that mean?" Michael met his father's gaze steadily. "Grandma's investing in my bookstore." "Investing." David's voice rose. "With what money?" "My money," I said quietly. "But," Richard began, then caught himself, glancing at the other guests. "Maybe we should discuss this privately, Mom." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied. "I'm making my own financial decisions now." David's face darkened. He looked like he wanted to say more, but Sarah interrupted with a story about their honeymoon to Cape Cod, the destination they'd chosen after receiving my modest gift. The conversation shifted, tension temporarily diffused. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Karen cornered me in the kitchen. "Eleanor, what's going on with you?" she demanded in a harsh whisper. "First, you refuse to help with the honeymoon. Then, we hear nothing from you for months. And now you're throwing money at Michael's pipe dream." "It's not a pipe dream," I replied calmly. "It's a solid business plan. Don't be naive. Bookstores aren't profitable anymore. He's using you." "No, Karen, I'm supporting my grandson's ambition. There's a difference." Her eyes narrowed. "David and I have been talking. We think it's time you consider moving somewhere more manageable. Sunrise Acres has lovely apartments, and the money from selling this house could help all of us." So, there it was. The plan Michael had overheard, now brought into the open. "This house isn't for sale," I said firmly, "and my living arrangements aren't up for family discussion." Before she could respond, David appeared in the doorway. "Everything okay in here?" "Just wonderful," I said, picking up the cake I'd baked that morning. "Shall we have dessert?" "In the living room." David cleared his throat as I began cutting the cake. Before we move on, Mom, there's something Karen and I want to discuss with everyone. My hand stilled on the cake knife. This wasn't part of the evening I had planned. We've been concerned about Mom's decision-making lately. David announced to the room. She's making unwise financial choices, isolating herself, and refusing family guidance. A stunned silence fell over the room. We think it's time to consider a power of attorney arrangement, he continued, for her own protection. George Thompson set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. That's a serious step. David, do you have evidence of diminished capacity? She's giving away money to fund a bookstore in the digital age. David replied as if that explained everything. And she's refusing to consider sensible downsizing options. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This moment had been inevitable from the day I'd started saying no. Your mother seems perfectly competent to me, George observed. You don't understand, David insisted, his voice rising. She's always relied on Dad and then on me for financial guidance. Now suddenly she's making these irrational choices. Enough. I set down the cake knife. I am not irrational, incapacitated, or in need of your guidance. David, Mom, be reasonable. I've been reasonable for 3 years. I interrupted. I've paid for renovations, vacations, cars, and a wedding. I've allowed you to treat me like a walking checkbook rather than your mother. But that stops now. David's face flushed dark red. Is this what you want? He demanded, gesturing around the table. To humiliate us in front of everyone, to make us look like villains. No, David, I said quietly. You've managed that all on your own. You selfish old woman, he hissed, standing up so abruptly his chair nearly toppled. After everything we've done for you. Karen tugged at his arm, suddenly aware of how this looked to the others. But David was beyond caring. You think you can just cut us off? Dad would be ashamed of you. It was at that precise moment that George Thompson cleared his throat and spoke the words that would change everything. Actually, David, and he said, your father anticipated this exact situation. The silence that followed George's words was absolute. David stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as George reached into his jacket and removed a familiar envelope. Robert added a codicil to his will shortly before he passed. George explained to the stunned room. He was concerned about how Eleanor might be treated after he was gone. What kind of codicil? Karen demanded, finding her voice first. George looked to me, silently asking permission. I nodded, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. The codicil states that any descendant who publicly humiliates Eleanor forfeits their entire inheritance. George said, his voice steady. This includes treating her with disrespect, attempting to control her finances against her wishes, or trying to force her from her home. That's ridiculous, David sputtered. Dad would never... He did, George interrupted. And as executor of his estate, I've been documenting the incidents over the past several months. He turned to me. Eleanor, I have to ask, do you want to enforce the codicil? All eyes turned to me. I looked at David and Karen, their faces now pale with shock and dawning horror. I looked at Sarah, who seemed confused and embarrassed. Then I looked at Michael, whose expression held nothing but quiet support. In that moment, I thought about everything that had happened since Thomas died. The name tag at the wedding, the honeymoon announcement at the brunch, the constant demands for money, the attempt to declare me incompetent, the plan to move me out of my home. I thought about the $250,000 I'd given them over 3 years. I thought about Thomas, who had tried to protect me even after he was gone. And I thought about myself, the woman I had been before grief made me vulnerable. and the woman I was becoming again as I reclaimed my dignity. "Yes," I said finally. "I do." David collapsed back into his chair. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," I replied. "The name tag at the wedding, the honeymoon announcement at the brunch, the constant demands for money, and now this attempt to declare me incompetent. All of it stops today." "But our inheritance," Karen whispered. "Is forfeit," George confirmed. "All of it?" Sarah asked, her voice small. George nodded. "I'm afraid so. The codicil is quite clear." "This isn't fair," and David suddenly shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "She tricked us. She let us believe the money was just sitting there waiting to be used." "No, David," I said quietly. "I never promised you anything. You assumed, you took, you demanded, but you never once asked what I needed or wanted." "What about Sarah and Jason?" Karen asked desperately. "They haven't done anything wrong." George consulted his notes. "Sarah was present at several incidents but didn't actively participate in the humiliation. However, she also never spoke up to defend Eleanor." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I should have said something at the wedding about the name tag." I reached across the table and took her hand. "We all make mistakes, sweetheart. The question is what we learn from them." "So what happens now?" Jason asked, putting his arm around Sarah. "Now," George said. "According to the terms of the codicil, David and Karen's share of Thomas's estate is redistributed." "To whom?" David demanded. "Half goes to Eleanor outright," George explained. "The other half is divided among descendants who have shown her proper respect and care." All eyes turned to Michael, who looked genuinely surprised. "I didn't know," he said quickly. "I swear, Grandma, I had no idea about any of this." "I know, sweetheart," I assured him. "Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become." David stood up again, his face contorted with anger. "This is a setup, a conspiracy. I'll contest it in court." "You're welcome to try," George said calmly. "But the codicil is legally binding, and we have ample evidence of the conditions being met." "Eleanor," Karen began. Her voice suddenly honeyed. "Surely we can work this out as a family. We never meant—" "Save it, Karen," I cut in. "It's too late for that." "Piggy." "So that's it," David demanded. "After everything we've done for you, you're just cutting us off." "No, David," I said, standing to face my son directly. "After everything I've done for you, I'm finally standing up for myself. There's a difference." The gathering ended shortly after. Sarah and Jason left with awkward apologies and promises to call soon. David and Karen stormed out without another word. George and the other guests made tactful exits, leaving just Michael and me in the sudden quiet of my home. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping me clear the barely touched dessert plates. "I'm better than okay, I replied, surprised to find it was true. "I feel free." As we cleaned up in comfortable silence, I thought about how strange life could be. I had lost my husband, then nearly lost myself in grief and manipulation. But through it all, I had found an unexpected ally in my grandson and rediscovered my own strength. Later that night, after Michael had gone home, I sat in Thomas's favorite chair and looked at his photograph on the mantel. "You knew this might happen," I said to his image. "You tried to protect me, but in the end, I had to learn to protect myself." I thought about David, about where we had gone wrong with him, about whether there was any path back from this breach. The sadness was there. Of course, what mother wouldn't mourn the loss of her relationship with her child? But beneath the sadness was something else relief. The weight of expectation, manipulation, and disrespect had been lifted. For years, I had been the one expected to give my money, my time, my self-respect. Now I had given myself something far more valuable: permission to be treated with dignity, permission to say no, permission to set boundaries and hold them firm. Thomas's codicil had been the catalyst, but the strength to enforce it had come from within me. In trying to safeguard his fortune, my husband had inadvertently helped me discover something far more precious: my own worth. As I turned out the lights and headed to bed, I felt lighter than I had in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. David would almost certainly contest the codicil. Relationships would need to be rebuilt or redefined, and I would need to figure out what this new chapter of my life would look like. But for the first time since Thomas died, I was looking forward to tomorrow rather than dreading it. The $250,000 I had given away over 3 years suddenly seemed like a small price to pay for this hard-won wisdom that respect couldn't be bought, dignity couldn't be begged for, and self-worth was something no one could take unless you handed it over willingly. I would never make that mistake again. 1 year later, I stood in the doorway of Chapter 1, the bookstore Michael had finally opened in a charming converted Victorian house downtown. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating shelves of carefully curated books and comfortable reading nooks. A coffee counter staffed by Michael's girlfriend Emma served locally roasted beans and homemade pastries. In the children's section, a mural I had painted covered one wall, a whimsical forest scene with hidden animals and fairy houses for young readers to discover. Twice a week, I led story time for neighborhood children, something I'd never imagined myself doing before. My painting classes at the community center had awakened an artistic talent I hadn't known I possessed, and the joy on children's faces when they spotted a cleverly hidden fox or rabbit in my mural was worth more than any compliment. The small apartment upstairs had been renovated as well. Not for me. I still loved my home with its memories of Thomas, but for a young writer-in-residence program Michael had established with part of his inheritance. It was currently occupied by a promising novelist working on her first book, a historical fiction set during the 1950s. The bell over the door jingled, and Sarah stepped in, pushing a stroller with her 3-month-old daughter, Thomasina named after her grandfather, though we all called her Tommy for short. "Grandma," Sarah called, spotting me. "I didn't know you'd be here today." "Just dropping off some new bookmarks I painted," I said, bending to admire baby Tommy. "Hello, little one." Over the past year, Sarah and I had slowly rebuilt our relationship. After the initial shock of the inheritance revelation, she had made genuine efforts to connect with me independently of her parents. Jason had proven to be a steadying influence, encouraging her to form her own opinions rather than echoing her mother's. The same could not be said for David and Karen. After several failed attempts to contest the codicil, they had moved to Florida, where David had taken a job with a former business associate. Our communication was limited to terse Christmas cards and occasional updates through Sarah. "Have you heard from your parents lately?" I asked, as Sarah settled at a small table with the baby. "Mom called last week," she said with a sigh. "Same conversation as always. Complaints about Dad's job, the house they had to settle for, how unfair everything is." "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Sarah said firmly. "They made their choices. I've made mine." Emma brought over coffee and fresh scones, cooing over the baby before returning to the counter where a customer waited. Michael emerged from the back room with a stack of new arrivals, his face lighting up when he saw us. "Perfect timing," he said, joining us at the table. I wanted to run something by you both. He explained his idea for expanding the store's community programs, including literacy tutoring for adults and writing workshops for teens. It would mean reinvesting some of the profits, he added, but I think it's worth it. I think it's wonderful, I said, feeling a surge of pride. As they discussed the details, I gazed around the sunlit bookstore, this beautiful space that represented not just Michael's dream, but a new chapter for all of us. In the years since the revelation, I had discovered parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. I'd made new friends, developed my painting skills, and even started traveling simple weekend trips at first. Then 2 weeks in Italy with a senior tour group where I'd met Frank, a widower from Boston with kind eyes and a dry wit who called me every Sunday. Thomas would have approved. I thought not just of the bookstore or my newfound independence, but of the boundaries I'd finally established. He had tried to protect me with his codicil, but in the end, I had learned to protect myself. There had been difficult moments. Of course, David's attorney had been aggressive in challenging the codicil, forcing me to endure depositions where my mental competence was questioned. The local country club crowd, mostly Karen's friends, had spread rumors about my mental decline and manipulation by Michael. There had been tearful phone calls from Sarah early on, begging me to reconsider for the sake of family harmony. But through it all, I had remained firm. The woman who had once written checks to keep the peace now stood her ground to maintain her dignity. I had discovered that respect couldn't be purchased. It could only be earned or, when necessary, demanded. The bookstore had become the center of a new community for me. Regular customers greeted me by name. Local authors sought my feedback on their work. Children ran to me at story time, eager to hear what adventure awaited them that day. I had gone from being valued only for my checkbook to being appreciated for my creativity, wisdom, and kindness. My financial support for Michael's venture had been structured as a proper investment with clear terms and arrangement he had insisted upon. I'm not them, he'd said firmly, referring to his parents. I want to earn this. And he had, turning a profit in the first year despite the challenging retail environment. Sarah's journey had been more complicated. After the confrontation, she had initially sided with her parents, avoiding me for months. But when she became pregnant, something shifted. I started thinking about what kind of family I want for my baby. She told me later, and I realized I didn't want to repeat the patterns. Now, watching her gently rock Tommy's stroller with her foot while discussing community literacy programs with Michael, I saw a young woman finding her own path, separate from the materialism and entitlement that had consumed her parents. "What do you think, Grandma?" Michael asked, pulling me into the conversation. "Should we start with the teen workshops or the adult literacy program?" I smiled at my grandson and granddaughter, at the baby who represented our future, at the bookstore that had grown from trust and respect rather than obligation and greed. "I think," I said, "that this is exactly where we're supposed to be." Jennifer's baby let out a happy gurgle, as if in agreement. This was my family now. Not perfect, not complete, but real. We were building something new from the ruins of what had been lost, and it was, in its own way, beautiful. In the years since that fateful birthday dinner, I discovered a new version of myself, one that Thomas would have been proud to see. I found joy in unexpected places, at my easel, painting whimsical forest murals for children, reading stories to wide-eyed toddlers at Michael's bookstore, and even walking hand in hand with Frank along the cobblestone streets of Florence during my first trip abroad without Thomas. My paintings became more than just a hobby. I developed a style all my own, vibrant landscapes with hidden details that rewarded careful observers. The community art director called my work joyfully contemplative, and to my surprise, my pieces began to sell. Not that I needed the money, but the validation warmed my heart in ways that writing checks for ungrateful family members never had. I made new friends through my classes, women who valued me for my insight and humor rather than my bank account. We met weekly for coffee, discussing books and art, and the peculiar freedom that comes in our 60s, the freedom to finally become who we truly are. And through it all, Michael and Sarah remain my anchors, proving that family doesn't have to be toxic. Baby Tommy's first words, first steps, and curious explorations of her grandmother's garden gave me a joy I thought had died with Thomas. Every Sunday evening, Frank would call from Boston, his gentle voice and thoughtful questions making me feel truly seen in a way I hadn't experienced since my husband's passing. What matters most, as Thomas used to say, isn't the hand you're dealt, but how you play your cards. And I was finally playing mine with wisdom, courage, and an open heart. My journey from grief-stricken widow to a woman reclaiming her joy holds a powerful lesson for anyone watching. Your worth is never measured by what you give to others, but by the dignity with which you treat yourself. For 3 years, I allowed grief to cloud my judgment. I mistook being used for being needed. I confused financial generosity with genuine connection. I let others define my value based on what I could provide rather than who I am. Perhaps you found yourself in a similar position, giving until you're empty, saying yes when your heart screams no, sacrificing your dignity on the altar of keeping peace. Maybe it's with family, friends, or colleagues who see you as a resource rather than a person deserving respect. Let my story be your permission slip to stand up and say, enough. It's never too late to draw boundaries. It's never too late to discover hidden talents. It's never too late to build authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided giving. Even at 66, I found that life still held beautiful surprises, new passions, new friendships, and yes, even new love. What part of your authentic self have you set aside to please others? What boundaries do you need to establish? What joy might be waiting if you gave yourself permission to explore? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share a time when you had to establish boundaries or rediscover yourself after loss. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us it's never too late to begin again. Like Eleanor, you deserve a life filled with dignity, respect, and joy. And sometimes that journey begins with a single, powerful no.